Here's a fascinating object with a fascinating symbol in the center of it. Note the human hand with the eye in the palm. Well, it turns out this is not from Africa or the Middle East like you might think. It's from Native American Mississippian culture, and this was one of the predominant symbols in their art, specifically the art of the cosmos. So let's dig in on why a hand and eye combination was one of the most important symbols in Mississippian culture. By the way, you'll notice on that large stone disc, the one we're going to look at today, and this one, that the hand is surrounded by two serpents, rattlesnakes specifically. We'll get into all that and keep it all pretty brief, but first let's touch on Mississippian culture. Mini recap for some of you, but the most influential and complex Native American society in the eastern half of the United States, best remembered for building these mounds, and there were communities built around these and with these. So really something that reminds us more of maybe Native society in Mexico than what we tend to think of as Native American society in what is now the United States. So very hierarchical, city-state, if you will, kind of settlements. The largest of these has a base wider than that of the Great Pyramid at Giza. This was a warrior culture, or at least war was a big part of it. Objects with this symbol have been found at burial sites that included weapons, and it was even represented on actual weapons themselves. Now, that doesn't mean this was like a symbol of war. Think of it more like kind of Crusader-era Christianity with, the cross being on the shield, things like that. It's your society's overarching worldview and mythos being displayed everywhere, including on your weapons. Here's a map indicating how far-flung Mississippian culture was. This included complex trade routes that took objects across vast swaths of the country. And now back to this. We are probably, have to say probably, looking at a representation of the pathway that souls take after death. Like some cultures from other parts of the world, Native Americans, or at least these, believed that your departed soul went along the Milky Way. The hand itself is most likely a representation of a part of what we would call Orion, right? They had a different constellation that only used some of the stars from Orion. But you've got that celestial spot and gateway represented. And this all plays into the overall worldview. So the Mississippian view of the entire universe was this tripartite model, 3 parts, which, exists in countless cultures, including Christianity. Heaven, earth, hell, upper world, our world while we're alive, and the underworld. Notice our hand and eye symbol over on the left. So you had to take the proper path to get to the upper world after you died. And if something went wrong, especially due to the way you lived your life, you might end up in the lower world. You had to avoid serpents, or you could get dragged down to the underworld instead and maybe end up even becoming one. And that explains the rattlesnakes on our stone disc. So obviously some serious echoes to pretty much, the predominant religions of the world today. The cosmological map here, this is not an ancient one, by the way, it's an artist's representation of what the whole universe would have looked like. Probably reminds you a lot of Norse mythology. We have this world tree acting as the axis that connects all of the layers, and the way that there's just so much going on. I switched pictures, but there was the underwater panther in the lower portion, which also contained the Corn Mother, the, quote, old woman who never dies, end quote. Here on this stone palette, we see 2 hands, and notice that they're on the right, so no, that symbol does not always need to occupy the center. What we do see are heads, and I would assume those are skulls, because skulls and bones were one of the other major visual symbols used in this kind of religious object. Most of them concerned death and or the afterlife, so like skulls and bones were death. The panther, we talked about him, God in the underworld, so death. The serpent, underworld association, also like we talked about. So anyway, speaking of symbols and the one we're concerned with, it exists elsewhere in world cultures, as I alluded to at the start of the video. So this is a common design seen in parts of Africa and especially the Middle East, and it's thought of as a protection against evil, especially the evil eye, as you can see there in that last sentence. Interesting then how the exact same design, for all intents and purposes, came about in completely different times and places. The Hamza, as the non-American version is called, goes all the way back to Mesopotamia. Here's an image from a video of mine showing another pretty obvious example of this kind of cross-cultural coincidence, right? The swastika is a really ancient symbol with parallel development in different places as well. And of course, it's the notable feature, to us anyway, in this plains flat bag and its exquisite beadwork. But you can go watch that video if you want to know more about the coincidences around that symbol and how Native Americans thought of it. Speaking of that, you may have noticed that a swastika appears in this diagram that we looked at earlier. It's in the underworld. Back to the hand and eye, or eye in hand. It's described both ways. When it comes to these discs, we don't know how they were used. It's proposed that they were probably a surface that was used to make elixirs on. Kind of a sacred workspace. We talked about the eye in hand's service as a portal, right? Well, it's more complicated than you think, because when we take this world map here, it turns out that there's a lot of motion in what we're looking at here, but you and I wouldn't know that, right? So, quote, is associated with the night sky, speaking of this kind of disk that we're looking at today, is associated with the night sky. In the Mississippian belief system, the below world moves up into the sky with the setting of the sun, trading places with the daytime sky. The entwined rattlesnakes form a portal through which the constellation Orion, represented by the hand and eye motif, can move from the below world into the night sky. I should mention this stone dates to about, roughly 1300 AD, and that would be around the height of the Mississippian culture. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you.